Welcome to this lesson on kings. We will continue with studying kings that come into power after the death of King Solomon. So let's take a beginning look at how this new era takes off. At the end of 1 Kings 11, it gave a little summary of Solomon's reign, and it said, the rest of the events of Solomon's reign, including all his deeds and his wisdom, are recorded in the book of the Acts of Solomon. Solomon ruled in Jerusalem over all of Israel for 40 years. When he died, he was buried in the city of David, named for his father, and then his son Rehoboam became the next king. So we have our succession. Now, Rehoboam chose Shechem for his place of inauguration or coronation. The kings had chosen coronation sites for various reasons. If you recall, David had chosen Hebron, which was where he had his earliest 7 years, and then while Jerusalem was being surrounded and captured, and then made the center after he had spent 7 years in Hebron. So then his son Adonijah had been chosen a place outside of Israel to be anointed and claimed to be the next king, even though that didn't happen to come true. Instead, it was Solomon, who also went outside of the city of Jerusalem and was coronated at Gihon. So each one of these sites represented some kind of political place that was important at the time. So Shechem is where Rehoboam chose, and this was a politically sensible choice for the kingdom, as at this point, after the death of Solomon, it seemed like the kingdom might divide into two parts. It had always been fragilely held together, with the northern tribes more like in a contract with the rule of Judah, the Judean king, than actually considering themselves part of one country. So Shechem is a pride of place. It's a good locale because it was recognized by all. Abraham, or Abram as he was known at the time, had migrated from Haran to Shechem, and it was one of the first sites where he settled. And it was also the site of a covenant ceremony once the people were coming back from Egypt and getting ready to enter the land of the land of Canaan, and become a community. And that was back in Joshua chapter 24. It's also set in Ephraim, which is further north, outside of the Judean territory. So it's in what's considered the northern territory. So it was an important region for the northern tribes. So why would Rehoboam choose this site? Well, it might have been as an overture to the northern tribes, because a Judean successor is coming to the throne. So Rehoboam, though we find that he was not very tactful, or neither was he compromising. So it's likely that the site of Shechem was a deliberate assertion instead of a compromise of his authority over the northern tribes. And because of that, his rule as a king would immediately be challenged. So according to the text, Jeroboam was in Egypt at the time of Rehoboam's coronation. Remember that Jeroboam had been anointed by Ahijah the prophet, and Solomon had gotten word of that, and therefore Jeroboam had gone into hiding. But he was summoned back now that Solomon had passed, and no doubt the northern tribes considered him to be a leader because he had been involved with the oversight of their tribes in earlier years. And so the northern leaders came before the new king Rehoboam, and they asked that their workload be lightened, for they in the north were the ones who had borne the brunt of Solomon's demands for corvée labor to work on his various building projects and expansion projects. And apparently there's still a chance here that Ahijah's prophesied fragmentation could be averted. The decision would lay in the hands of Rehoboam and to follow the path of oppression set by his father or to take a different course. But we find out in 1 Kings 12 that Rehoboam does not choose to keep a compromising view or compromising rule with the northern tribes. Instead, he says that he will, rather than decrease, he will increase the work commands and demands of the northern tribes. And when the tribes heard this, the elders heard this, they said, when all Israel realized the king had refused to listen to them, they responded with, "Down with the dynasty of David. We have no interest in the son of Jesse. Back to your homes, O Israel. Look out for your own house, O David." And so the people of Israel returned home, but Rehoboam continued to rule over the Israelites who lived in the towns of Judah. So he's just down to the southern area now. The northern tribes have split away. So the rift was about to happen rather than keeping them united as 12 tribes. Now we have 10 and 2. And as an opinion then, to this day, the northern tribes of Israel have refused to be ruled by a descendant of David. And when the people of Israel learned of Jeroboam's return from Egypt, they called an assembly and they made him king over all Israel. So only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the family of David. Now, the tribe of Judah also incorporated the tribe of Benjamin because they are such a small group that they're often referred to as one. Now, Shemaiah the prophet, a man of God, came to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, and all the people of Judah and Benjamin, and the rest of the people living there, and said, "This is what the Lord says. Do not fight against your relatives, the Israelites. Go back home, for what has happened is my doing." And so they obeyed the message of the Lord and went home as the Lord had commanded. So he's letting them know that the Lord had already foreseen this, and that it was part of the plan overall. So here we have this chart of the kings and prophets of Israel and Judah. We'll keep referring to this frequently. We see them lined up side by side in parallel lines. So we have the kingdom of Israel on this side with all of their kings, and we have the kingdom of Judah on this side with all of their kings. We also see a number of prophets who speak through to the kings during these periods of history and following when they are in captivity. These are the prophets who have literature that is attached or recording their prophecy, and so they have written work. There are also many other prophets that are referred to, just like the one we just heard of, who do not have written literature but are still prophets. And so we'll follow these lines of kings, and they run parallel. And so in the reading, it's sometimes difficult to keep track of who's who, because they keep referring to this one who was ruling at the same time as this one, and vice versa. So you can refer to the chart occasionally to kind of help you keep that all straight. But today, in this lesson, we will look at 3 or 4 kings who rule in Israel during the time of only 2 kings well, 3 if you count one that ruled for 2 years in Judah. So the periods of time match up, but you can see that on this side you have more kings and on this side you have fewer. These have longer terms generally, not always, but generally, than the ones on this side. Also, pointing out that these will always be descendants of the line of David. But on this side, we start out with Jeroboam, but all of them will not be descendants of David. They will be other people who rise to power in various ways. So we'll look at Jeroboam of Israel first. Now, Jeroboam had come back from Egypt, was now crowned the king of the northern tribes, and he will become the person that all the following kings are compared to in Israel. So Jeroboam feared that the northern tribes, now called Israel under his watch, would return to Judah to worship in the center in Jerusalem where the temple was. And to discourage this, he built 2 centers for worship, one in Bethel and one in Dan. And to each of them, he added a golden calf. He had people recall the days of Egypt and the gods of Egypt. Jeroboam built shrines throughout Israel, and he worshiped pagan gods. And he used non-Levitical priests, in other words, people not from the tribe of Levi. So they were not legitimate priests appointed by God. And he set up celebrations throughout the land, different but similar celebrations to what would be taking place in Jerusalem, but at different times. So it's kind of setting up his whole new system of worship. And so here's a map. Let's look at the green part, the part of Israel, because we're mostly focusing on Israel this week. Here in Bethel, on the southern part of the kingdom of Israel, and up here in Dan on the northern part of the kingdom of Israel, we have the 2 sanctuaries for worship, the 2 main ones. And then here in Samaria, we will see that this is an area that later, one of the kings later will make the capital of the kingdom. And then Shechem here, you can see, is into a good distance within Israel. And so in order to be crowned, Rehoboam would have traveled up here to Shechem. So choosing this site, and all the northern tribes would have gathered there. And then we know that they decided they would not serve Rehoboam in the southern kingdom. So we'll come back and look at the south when we study the south. Jeroboam's political intentions were likely much more powerful than his faith connections. The golden calves were symbolic. They're not intended to be worshipped, but the calves did remind God of being with Israel, just as the ark was a symbol for an invisible God. So the calves are symbols for an invisible God. Thereafter, though, Jeroboam is the king to which all of the other kings will be compared, and how great or how evil their actions were. So Jeroboam is like the measuring stick against which all the other kings have to measure up or down. And just a few different incidents or stories within the lifetime of Jeroboam. A man of God, a prophet, unnamed, foretold that King Josiah would many years later destroy the altars that Jeroboam had made at Bethel and Dan. and that this king was King Josiah. We'll read about him in the Second Kings book chapter 22. And a prophet performed a miracle on the healing of Jeroboam's hand. It's clear that the Lord was not at Bethel, but rather the word of the Lord was brought into Israel by prophets who came from Judah. A false prophet led the prophet from Judah astray, and then the prophet was struck down and died. And both of them, the false prophet plus the prophet from Judah who was led astray by the false prophet, they both died. At the time of Jeroboam's son, Baasha became very sick, and Jeroboam told his wife, "Disguise yourself so that no one will recognize you as my wife, and then go to the prophet Ahijah at Shiloh, the man who told me I would become the king." And God then told Ahijah, "She will come and ask you about her son, for he's very sick, and give her this answer: I have bad news for you." And Ahijah said to Jeroboam's wife, "Go on home, and when you enter the city, the child will die. All Israel will mourn for him and bury him. He's the only member of your family who will have a proper burial, for this child is the only good thing that the Lord, the God of Israel, sees in the entire family of Jeroboam." This is interesting, I think, because it's very demeaning and denigrating to not be buried according to family and kingdom traditions. And so this is the only descendant of Jeroboam who receives a proper burial. Jeroboam reigned in Israel 22 years, and when he died, his son Nadab became the next king. It was Ahijah who had prophesied Jeroboam's coming to power, and now Ahijah sent an oracle to Jeroboam through his wife, reiterating the word of the Lord that was first delivered to him. Jeroboam's sins are enumerated, and the sins that he did provoked the anger of God. And that terrible anger is evident because the punishment for the house of Jeroboam is very harsh. Not only will the men of the dynasty be killed, but they will be left unburied as well, abandoned to the dogs in the city and the birds of prey in the countryside. And as I already said, this is a great sign of disregard and disrespect. So there's cause and effect here in play. For his sins, the house of Jeroboam is cut off and his dynasty is brought to an end. Whereas by contrast, in Judah, the house of Rehoboam would survive despite its chastisement that God brought by way of invasion and plunder. Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, died prematurely. Abijam, the son of Rehoboam, lives to succeed his father. So a little comparison then between the two kings, the north and the south. And now in the north, in Israel, Nadab will rule. He's the son of Jeroboam, and he began to rule over Israel in the second year of King Asa's reign in Judah. So we see a comparison there, back and forth. He reigned in Israel for 2 years, but he did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and followed the example of his father, continuing sins that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit. So a leader is responsible for what happens with the people. You can see here that Nadab is compared to his father Jeroboam, as kings in the future will be. And now Baasha, son of Ahijah, from the tribe of Issachar, plotted against Nadab and assassinated him while he and the Israelite army were laying siege to the Philistine town of Gibbethon. Baasha killed Nadab in the 3rd year of King Asa's reign in Judah, and he became the next king of Israel. So now we don't have a lineage of Jeroboam. We have someone else from a different tribe who is now ruling. Here's a comparison. So far, we've only had 2 kings in Judah, and we are already down to the 4th one in Israel. So we had Jeroboam and Abijah. Then we have a break in the patriarchal line, and we have a usurper, Nadab, and then we'll have his son Baasha. And Baasha, I'll go back, I forgot who it was here. Nadab immediately slaughtered all the descendants of King Jeroboam, so that not one of the royal family was left, just as the Lord had promised concerning Jeroboam by the prophet from Shiloh. This was done because Jeroboam had provoked the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by the sins he committed and the sins he led Israel to commit. So again, the same cause and effect. But there was constant war between King Asa of Judah and King Baasha of Israel. So remember, we just had a few slides back the admonition that we should not have war between the tribes because they are family, between the 2 factions, north and south. But this has not lasted. In chapter 16, the message from the Lord was delivered to King Baasha by a prophet, Jehu, son of Hanani. I lifted you out of the dust to make you ruler of my people Israel, but you have followed the evil example of Jeroboam, and you have provoked my anger by causing my people to sin, of Israel to sin. And so here again, we have the ruler is responsible for the way of the people, leading the people correctly in worship. He has not done so. And he's being compared to Jeroboam, the first king of Israel. So here's the same result, the same consequence. So now I will destroy you and your family, just as I destroyed the descendants of Jeroboam, son of Nadab, and the members of Baasha's family will die in the city, will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the field will be eaten by vultures. A very disrespectful and disgraceful ending. So let's take a look at this video from the Northern Kingdom of Israel. This will do a pretty complete overview of the kingdom, more so even than what we've read in this section, but I think you will appreciate the view from this lecture.
Now let's turn to the rise and fall of the Northern Kingdom, the kingdom that proudly called itself Israel, in contrast to the Southern Kingdom, which still largely covered the ancient tribal territory of Judah. Reading between the lines in the Bible, it is evident that there were many signs of trouble long before Solomon breathed his last. Absalom's attempted coup against his father, King David, had nearly succeeded because of the wide support he enjoyed among the tribal elders of the north. The fact of the matter was that the tribal chieftains in the north had only accepted the kingship of David in order to defeat the Philistine invasion, and they had never agreed that the monarchy should draw its kings exclusively from the tribe of Judah. There was also much resentment over the choice of Jerusalem as the locus of national worship. The concentration of Yahweh worship in the temple had effectively put the sanctuaries in the north out of business, even though the shrines of Bethel, Shechem, and Shiloh could claim a pedigree going back to the days of Abraham and Jacob. And Solomon's use of forced labor had damaged the economy in the north, depriving it of farmers to tend to its fields and its orchards. What precipitated the break was a new conspiracy led by Jeroboam, Solomon's minister of forced labor. Solomon discovered the conspiracy and ordered his arrest. But Jeroboam was able to escape to Egypt, where King Shishak granted him political asylum. This King Shishak, as the Bible calls him, is probably Shoshenq I, who founded the 22nd dynasty in 945 BC. In Egypt, Jeroboam continued to plot against Israel. Unfortunately, Solomon's successor, his son Rehoboam, was a deeply insecure man who was wholly unfit to deal with the budding crisis. After his accession to the throne, the new king tried to renew the Treaty of Unification with the northern tribes, but the elders rebuffed him. "Your father made our yoke heavy," the tribal elders said, referring to the forced labor and the heavy taxes. "So, lighten the hard service of your father, and we will serve you." Foolishly, Rehoboam refused. In fact, he said he would make the yoke of service even heavier, like scorpions. Well, that was like pouring gasoline on a fire. "What share do we have in David?" the elders cried. "To your tents, O Israel." And so the kingdom split. The turncoat, Jeroboam, was anointed king of the north, which insisted on calling itself Israel. And Rehoboam fled back to Jerusalem. His kingdom had now shrunk to little more than the territory of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and would now be known as the Kingdom of Judah. To make matters worse, King Shoshenq used the political chaos to invade Judah with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 cavalry. Now, again, these numbers are probably an exaggeration, but the invasion itself is most likely a historical event. Shoshenq was trying hard to restore the greatness of Egypt. According to the pharaoh's hieroglyphs on the Temple of Amun in Karnak, Shoshenq attacked Judah's southern border around 918 BC. The Egyptian army then laid siege to Jerusalem. In desperation, Rehoboam sued for terms and watched helplessly as the Egyptian pharaoh made off with the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, as the Bible says. He took everything. For Rehoboam, there was only one small comfort. Not content with raiding Jerusalem, Shoshenq then continued north and invaded the kingdom of his former guest, Jeroboam, plundering all the way to the north's mightiest fortress, that of Makketu, the Egyptian version of Megiddo. Almost 3,000 years later, archaeologists working on Megiddo found pieces of a victory slab dedicated to Shoshenq's triumph. Pharaoh then returned to Egypt and ordered the construction of a monument, the Bubastite portal, in the Temple of Karnak. He also insisted that the artists try to imitate the style and quality of the triumphal reliefs by Ramses II as much as possible. And so began the period of the divided monarchy, according to the Bible. The northern kingdom would last for only 2 centuries, and 7 of its 19 kings would die a violent death. Judah, the southern kingdom, fared a bit better. It would last for 350 years, ruled all the way by descendants of the house of David. Then it too would be destroyed. As we saw earlier, many historians do not agree with this chronology of events. They do not contest the existence of two Hebrew kingdoms, because these are indeed attested by archaeological evidence, as we will see. But they believe that these kingdoms emerged as separate entities from the very beginning, and that the unified monarchy is probably a utopian concept from later times. The reason, these authors write, is that these two kingdoms emerged during a very volatile time, with many power shifts in the Middle East. After Shoshen's death in 924 BC, new empires rose in Mesopotamia and Anatolia to take Egypt's place as the dominant superpower of the region. Poised between the grinding forces of these giants, tiny Israel and Judah embarked on a dangerous game of power politics. Many Hebrew kings attempted to recapture the glory of the Davidic kingdom by making aggressive alliances for the sake of territorial expansion. That is what doomed them in the end. Whatever the case may be, there is no question that the north was the more powerful of the two kingdoms. Archaeologists who have studied this period, known as Iron Age 2B, so from 900 to 800 BC, believe that the northern kingdom became the dominant monarchy because it had more people and covered a far larger territory than Judah. The northern tribes also had the best farmlands and fertile foothills, including the Jezreel Valley. With its manpower now restored, the north could begin to exploit these rich agricultural lands with the production of olive oil, wine, figs, dates, and cereals. This surplus was then used for trade against commodities from abroad. That is how the north became a state in the true sense of the word by around the 9th century. Of course, from a religious point of view, the north did not have a temple like the one in Jerusalem, or the Ark of the Covenant for that matter. That's why King Jeroboam had decided to reactivate the ancient shrines of Dan and Bethel. He even developed religious festivals to compete with the ones in Jerusalem. But it is not clear whether these sanctuaries were truly dedicated to Yahweh, like the temple in Jerusalem. For example, Jeroboam installed gold bulls in both Dan and Bethel, which was the traditional idol of the Canaanite god El. That reference in the Bible was illustrated when in 1992, excavators stumbled on the Dan sanctuary by chance, and there they found a stone platform, the Bama, or high place, where the golden calf could have been placed. They also found a horn from the main altar, as well as a smaller horned altar that was still intact. Though Jeroboam was responsible for these shrines, the real architect of the new Commonwealth of the North was a king named Omri, who ascended the throne around 885 BC. The first thing that Omri did was make peace with all of the surrounding states. That included the oasis city of Damascus, which straddled the caravan route known as the King's Highway, and which was therefore Israel's natural rival in seeking to control the flow of trade through the region. Omri also made peace with the kingdom of Judah to the south, and with King Ethbal, as the Bible calls him. This was probably King Itobal of Sidon on the Phoenician coast. The alliance was sealed faithfully with the marriage of Omri's son, Ahab, to Jezebel, daughter of Itobal, with very tragic results, as we will see. Omri then took the offensive. In an effort to outflank Aram Damascus, he conquered the land of Moab, east of the Dead Sea. His victory is acknowledged by the Stone of Moab, which states that Omri humbled Moab for many years. Omri made such an impression on his rivals that long after the king's death, Assyrian texts would refer to Israel as Bit Humri, the house of Omri. The king was now able to focus on creating a new capital for the northern kingdom. Obviously, it would have to rival Jerusalem in the south. So Omri settled on a spot located on a summit in the hills of Ephraim, just northwest of Shechem. But for that, we have to travel to the West Bank. Omri's new city, Samaria, overlooked the road that linked the Transjordan and the King's Highway with the coastal trade routes along the Mediterranean. Harvard's Clarence Fisher excavated the area in the early 20th century and uncovered a palace that was much enlarged in later years. Amid the ruins, he found fragments of decoration in ivory, created by artists from Phoenicia. This beautiful site was excavated just a few decades ago. But today, because of the political tensions in the West Bank, we are very close to the city of Nablus. This place is entirely deserted. No tour buses, no tourists. I am the only person on site. Construction of Samaria continued under Omri's successor, his son Ahab, who, as we saw, had married a Phoenician princess. That may explain why he tolerated and even encouraged a growing merger of the worship of Yahweh with pagan deities such as Asherah or Astarte, goddess of love and fertility, as well as Baal, god of dew and rain. These were all prerequisites for a successful harvest. According to the first book of Kings, this incurred the wrath of the prophet Elijah, the first of many prominent prophets who would minister during the period of the divided monarchy. Apparently, there were no less than 450 prophets of Baal who ate at the table of Ahab's wife, the princess Jezebel. Elijah challenged them all. He proposed a test conducted on Mount Carmel to see whose sacrifice would be lit by a lightning from heaven. That proposal was a very shrewd move, for lightning was the favorite attribute of Baal in his capacity as god of storms. But Elijah won hands down. Only his sacrifice was lit by God. The Bible claims that the priests of Baal were then put to death, but actually, excavations show that the use of fertility figures and amulets bearing the image of Astarte continued. Perhaps the worship of these pagan fertility gods had always continued under the surface, as it were, because farmers were naturally anxious to protect their harvest at all costs. That may also explain why Elijah cursed the house of Ahab. All of Israel and Judah would be destroyed, he warned, except for those who remained faithful to Yahweh. That prophecy was fulfilled when Ahab was killed during a war against Israel's old enemy, Aram Damascus, and his son died after a fall. Ahab's second son, Jehoram, was then ousted by an army commander named Jehu, and Ahab's queen Jezebel was literally thrown out the window. The subsequent fate of the northern kingdom is the subject of the second book of Kings. As I said earlier, this was a time of great shifts in the power plays of the region, and the principal actor of those movements was the Empire of Assyria. In the mid-9th century BC, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III began to make moves to the south, with his eyes on Aram Damascus, Phoenicia, the northern kingdom, Judah, and even Egypt. These nations had all been rivals and enemies at one point or another, but the common threat of Assyria made them set all those old animosities aside to form the first military coalition in the region's history. Having gathered their forces, the allies met the Assyrian army in 853 near Karkar, some 150 miles north of Damascus. This dramatic clash is described in great detail in a large stela found in the city of Kurk in southeast Turkey. At the top is the profile of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, surrounded by the symbols of his patron gods, Ashur, Ishtar, Anu, and Sin. And the stone confirms that the king faced a very large and determined force. The kingdom of Israel is also mentioned, for the stone says that Israel's forces joined the battle with no less than 2,000 chariots and 10,000 horses under the command of Ahabu, which of course refers to King Ahab. The stone claims that the Assyrian army won a great victory, but that's doubtful because the Assyrians tried again to invade more than a decade later. And this time they came up against King Jehu of Israel, who ascended the throne in 841 BC. And this time the Assyrian forces were indeed successful because the coalition had been disbanded and once again Israel was on its own. That at least is the claim recorded on a great black obelisk discovered in 1846 by Henry Layard in the ancient city of Nimrod. On it we see King Shalmaneser accompanied by the winged god Ashur as he receives tribute from a king who is identified as follows: the tribute of Jehu, son of Omri. In other words, Israel had now become a vassal state. But eventually, Shalmaneser died, and the Assyrians lost interest in their vassals. They had their hands full with internal politics and challenges to their rule. But that changed when the new king took charge of Assyria half a century later. His name was Tiglath-Pileser III, or King Pul in the Bible, a name that would inspire shock and awe throughout the Middle East. The new king wasn't interested in having a series of vassal states. He wanted to own these lands by conquering them and creating a vast new empire that would stretch from the Tigris to the Nile. In 735, Tiglath-Pileser was close to realizing this goal. His armies moved down the Mediterranean coast, capturing all the port cities down to Gaza, and were now approaching the borders of Egypt. Of course, the whole Near East was in uproar, including Israel. Once again, everyone agreed that regional quarrels had to be put aside to form a defensive alliance. The Northern Kingdom, too, joined this coalition, but surprisingly, Judah did not. It was always deeply suspicious of any movements by the north. And so its ruler at the time, King Ahaz, decided that this alliance was really an attempt by the north to isolate and ultimately overrun the south. And so Judah took the fateful step of not only giving the alliance the cold shoulder, but going over to the other side by joining Assyria. A terrible move. Of course, Tiglath-Pileser was overjoyed by this overture because that gave him a perfect staging ground to attack the coalition. The Assyrian forces were able to roll up Syria, Tyre, and Ashkelon, as well as the northern kingdom. As the second book of Kings says, the Assyrian king captured Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee, and all the land of Naphtali, and carried the people captive to Assyria. Now, that was actually something new. In the past, an enemy force could conquer you and force you to pay tribute, but never before had a foreign invader also carried out wholesale deportations. And that now became a serious policy. Entire villages were forcefully removed to Assyria, as illustrated by a dramatic 8th century relief from the palace in Nimrod. Only a small rump state around Samaria, ruled by King Hoshea, was allowed to exist. But that ended with the rise of a new Assyrian king, Sargon II. He picked up where Tiglath-Pileser left off. And this time, Samaria was depopulated as well. As we read in 2 Kings, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. And he placed them in Halah, on Habor, by the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Let's see if we can identify these places on a map. Halah was located northeast of Nineveh. Habor, a tributary of the Euphrates, is today called Habur, and the cities of the Medes lay to the east of the Assyrian heartland, close to today's Iran. The Deuteronomist authors of these passages have an explanation for why the northern kingdom came to fall. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out, they write. And they did this secretly, these wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. We have to remember that these sections are colored by the political outlook of Judah, where these authors and scribes lived and worked. There is a bit of schadenfreude in between these lines, because the tension between North and South had really never been resolved. At the same time, however, the terrible fate of the North also served as an object lesson for the people of Judah. It revealed that the South would have a similar fate unless they too repented and returned to observing the covenant law. But as we will see in a later lecture, that is not what the people of Judah did, and so they too paid the ultimate price. But before we turn our attention to the rise and fall of Judah, let's first take a look at the empire of Assyria itself. What made these people so powerful? Did their military have some secret weapon that made them all but invincible? As we will see in the next lecture, the answer is yes.
All right, I think that's a really good overview of Israel, and it goes further than what we've read so far. However, as we read into the future, I think remembering what he's told us in this video and the visuals with it will help us understand what we're reading. It also answers the question that sometimes comes up about what happened to the 10 tribes of Israel, and there's been multiple theories about that, but in this video that we just saw, we have the answer to that question. They eventually became absorbed into different areas of the Assyrian Empire, and only a very small faction of people remained back in the city of Samaria and its surrounding area. And those are the people that we see Jesus encounter in the New Testament. He does not avoid Samaria. And you can see in the New Testament that this history that we're studying is part of how people are responding to different situations that we read about as we follow the life of Jesus in the New Testament. Just a quick overview. Again, we will come back and look in more detail at Judah when we study that portion. And so just kind of a general overview of what's in that area. We are reading in Kings, and so we're through up to about 1 Kings 17, and we'll read into the second book of Kings, chapter 8, and we'll probably be reading in this for a couple of times, so you can begin this work now of reading. Have a good week. You can see that we have on this division that we will be coming up on a video for the Assyrian Empire, which he was talking about. But it isn't this week, and it won't be next week, but it will be soon thereafter. Have a blessing for you this week. See the flowers, beautiful, reminding us that spring is on its way with the rainfall that we've been having. O Lord of hosts, blessed is the one who trusts in you. Psalm 84, verse 12. For your reading this week, you might want to check out Psalm 13. And I will leave you with a joke in which you can keep in mind if you decide to go out car shopping anytime soon. These may be some of your choices. Do you need a one-hump camel or a two-hump camel? Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you back soon.